Okay, one of the things that we always try to do is find really good presenters, obviously, for this particular event. I hate to tell you, but I sent a lot of emails to professors at U of M. Nobody responded. What can I say? Boo. However, the Michigan State folks were very responsive, and I can't thank them enough for agreeing to make a presentation. One of the things I want to do is just get a title for the presentation. So I figured just say AI at Michigan State, right? Just make it simple. They can tell us what's going on. You've already met Bill Hart-Davidson. Again, he's a professor and associate dean of research and graduate education, College of Arts and Letters at Michigan State. But joining him will be Jeremy Van Hoff. Dr. Van Hoff is the teaching center director, Center for Teaching and Learning Innovation at Michigan State University. So one of the things that we want to try to do is kind of a professorial approach, but also then a faculty support perspective. So I can't thank you guys enough for agreeing to come and make a presentation today on telling us what's happening at Michigan State University. Go green.
Hi there. Thanks so much. I was reminded on the drive in today of T.S. Eliot's line that April is the cruelest month because there was a blizzard that hit between Flint and Pontiac while I was on I-75. I mean, I'm not complaining about driving in Michigan weather, but it was well worth plowing through to get here. You've been very gracious, and thank you for the hospitality and the excellent conversations, taking a lot away from today. I called this the sand and the clouds because that's where everyone's heads seem to be with relation to generative AI.
There's one other place, but we didn't.
Well, yeah, we didn't put that one. The U of M guys would have. But it's been kind of I actually came up to, I was being interviewed by the student newspaper, and I'm an old journalism teacher. That was my first career. So I like to try to speak in quotes and headlines when I'm being interviewed by journalism students. And I came up with this line that we need to get people's heads out of the sand and out of the clouds. And he wrote that down and was very excited. And I'm like, I'm going to steal it too. I'm going to steal my own line and repurpose it. But it really is the truth that we've got a lot of people on our campus that I work with daily who are intentionally avoiding this issue or are just not adjacent to the issue at all and are not giving it any headspace. And there are a lot of people, fewer, but a significant population who see generative AI as the end all and be all of education. And it's, you know, we've all got to be using it all the time for everything. And I think both populations are presenting problems for the work that I do in faculty development, educator development. And I think they're presenting problems in the research community. They're presenting problems all over the place. And they are not just faculty members, it's students, it's staff, it's everyone that falls into these buckets. So my work largely in the last few months has been to find that happy middle ground. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about here today, about what we've been doing over the last 18 months at Michigan State to identify and try to populate that happy middle ground and where we currently stand in that mission and where we believe that we're headed. So, Bill, I'm going to give it to you first to talk about, which you touched on briefly earlier, but talk about kind of that period from November of 22 to, you know, February of 23.
Yeah. So the end of November 22 is when we saw the announcement for ChatGPT. And honestly, it came at the end of the semester. You all might remember on your own campuses. And just like we're facing now, we're entering the 3-week stretch when everybody has their head down and it's just a mad rush to finish the semester. So we didn't actually see a big response immediately in December of 22. But over the Christmas break, as soon as people had a moment to take a deep breath and they started seeing the demos, maybe started playing with ChatGPT themselves, we started to get, and I'm curious to see what Jeremy saw, because at the time he was working in the College of Business.
Correct.
But what I started to get in our dean's office was, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? And so we have a group on campus that Jeremy and his counterpart in my college, Scott Schuperai, and a few others had created a a collaborative group led by the business school, the College of Arts and Letters, the College of Natural Science, and College of Engineering, maybe?
Oh, just those three.
Just those three. Engineers, we don't need them. They caused this problem to begin with. They had, prior to this and coming out of that pandemic period, the rapid shift to remote and online learning, had formed this really tight collaborative group, and they were already driving a number of the faculty development and resource related things around online learning in a much more positive way. And they had matured as an organization as well. So they were getting grants, they were writing together and publishing, presenting at EDUCAUSE, and that group is really strong still today. Luckily, we had them. And so pretty quickly, I think like before Christmas, we had a Teams group on Microsoft Teams start to form, and we were planning an event in January. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so that event unfolded in mid-January, roughly.
I think so.
Yeah, because the semester, we let the semester start, and then and we didn't really know what it was going to be, but we kind of framed it as the impact of large language models on the teaching of writing. That was basically the premise.
Yeah.
But we opened it up to the instructional faculty from all three of our constituent colleges, and had no idea what the attendance was be. I think, what do we have in the room? Plus Zoom, I think we had 250 people that showed up.
It was larger than we
It was way bigger than we anticipated. And it turned into like a 4-hour symposium that we ran on one afternoon. And Bill gave a talk kind of explaining the history and technical nature of LLMs. I gave a talk about what ChatGPT 3.5 could do because it was still, we were very much in like, what is this thing phase.
Many people had never seen it.
Yeah.
For real. They just heard the name.
Yeah. And then we had a panel of faculty members that talked and everything. And it was great. It was a healthy conversation. The big takeaway from it really was that Teams group, that Microsoft Teams chat that we planned the event around. We just invited everyone in the room to join it. And it turned into this very organic, kind of grassroots, campus-wide conversation about all things generative AI. And that chat still is active today. People are posting in it now. And it'll be everything from look at what this new tool is doing to look at how this specific funding entity within NSF is requiring that you use AI in your proposal, and everything in between. And with the exception of an assistant provost, there weren't, the highest level administrators in the room were assistant deans or their like. So it was really kind of a staff and faculty led initiative, and it kind of has remained such on our campus for the entire 18 months that followed. We lost some momentum, in large part because there was the tragic shooting on campus like 3 weeks after this symposium took place, and that obviously sucked the air out of a lot of these types of initiatives on campus. So things kind of stagnated over the course of this semester, but I think that probably would have happened regardless of externalities, just because of the nature of the academic calendar. But that group stayed active in talking about it. And by, mid-April, we realized that not enough had been done on the campus level to talk about what this was going to mean for the fall of 23. And so I reconvened what I called the meeting of the minds, which was kind of the people who were most active in that group from two key populations, IT leadership and academic. And I said, okay, we got to talk about what we're going to do surrounding generative AI over this summer. All you 9-month appointees, you can run off and do your thing, but we're going to be here worrying about this. And we need to be ready for when students hit campus in the fall, because over the summer, they're all going to realize the power of this thing and they're all going to want to use it. So we sat down in the business college for another 4-hour session, and those two groups, I'll talk about the IT stuff. Maybe you can talk about where we went with the academic. The primary takeaways were 2.5 fold kind of. The first was about procurement and identifying ChatGPT specifically, we have like a procurement tier list where things are kind of fast tracked for security and FERPA compliance and all that kind of stuff. So they elevated GPT 3.5 to the tier 1 procurement status, meaning that it's as easy as possible for people to gain access to it on campus. That IT group also, as a result of this work, came out with pretty comprehensive data security guidance. It wasn't too far removed from the existing data guidance on campus, but it clarified the implications of generative AI and LLMs on that data guidance and gave some recommendations on how to treat data, what data could and could not be used in it, and in what contexts it could be used. And then the 0.5 takeaway was a growing awareness of the problematic, of the significant problems surrounding AI detection tools, because by May of 23, it was already becoming clear that these things were problematic. And they came out ultimately with guidance campus-wide to prohibit the use of AI detection tools as the sole identifier of academic dishonesty for written work on campus. And I think that that was really successful. And, it was backed by research and specific evidence that it was, huge numbers of false positives at the time and really problematic for people for whom English isn't the primary language, for people with learning disabilities. There were all kinds of red flags surrounding the use of those tools. They also locked down Turnitin because Turnitin had like a default on AI detection thing, and that did not go over well on our campus either. And so part because of this meeting and the awareness on the AI detection problems, we were able to nip that in the bud before it took off on our campus too much. So that's where the IT stuff happened. And a lot of that guidance ultimately came out mid-July of 23, so midsummer, which I think was good because that's right when the fiscal year starts. So that procurement stuff, it was important to get that in place as people were beginning the budgeting processes for the 23-24 fiscal year. And then you want to talk about the academic side?
Yeah, I would say there were two roughly corresponding to our theme, our title words, responses from faculty, the head in the sand and the head in the clouds version, slightly different perhaps. And they were equally strident and driving the messages that we were getting that were coming from the faculty up to the dean's office or their chair's offices, and then to the dean's office and then to the provost. One of these, because we're a research institution and faculty feel, some competitive pressure to not be bested by their academic peers, was a desire to have access to these tools because it looked like everything was going to go in that direction and quickly. And it felt like you could get left behind if you weren't paying attention or you didn't have access. That was not helped by the fact that University of Michigan made a big announcement, which we didn't put on our timeline, that they were going to train their own model and make it available campus-wide. So we heard what would later become a trend, in which we'll talk about, I think, is a ongoing trend that we're perhaps just behind as a result of our more cautious stance on our campus, and that is campuses making enterprise level agreements with these model providers so that their campus community, faculty, students, staff could have some access to this model and do so within their safety and compliance guidelines. So that was happening. We were already hearing, when are we going to get one? When are we getting a model? And we're still hearing that. The other was the sort of twin worries of, how is this going to affect what I'm teaching now? So coming into the spring and especially looking at the summer, we were looking at another one of these summers where we were going to have to use time off to retrain or re-prepare. And there was a lot of deep breathing going on for people who lead multi-section courses. First developing syllabus language, but then pretty quickly looking at how are we going to change the standard set of assignments? How are we going to change our assessment criteria and student learning outcomes? This was being coordinated by the EDLI group across campuses. So they stayed in touch, folks like Stephen Thomas, who is our our colleague in the College of Natural Science, did a ton of professional development work for maybe 3 levels coming into that fall semester that let faculty sort themselves into, and they were comparable to what we heard this morning in this morning's talk. So I want to thank folks for providing that as a kind of confirmation that we weren't that far off. But there were well, I have to spend at least a day to acknowledge it and draw a boundary kind of level of engagement. Maybe I'll do one project or one unit on it kind of engagement. And then maybe I need to incorporate this. Maybe I can't shy away at all, but I want to have a fully integrated approach to Gen AI in my course. And that's where we started to see these subpopulations also begin to find one another and share materials. Everything from syllabus language and short pieces like that, value statements, evaluation guides and rubrics, to full-blown course designs. And so that's where we entered the fall, I would say.
Yeah, just a couple of points that I'll mention too. Over the course of that spring 23 semester, the fastest growing student organization on campus was the MSU AI student org. It went from being a handful of kind of coding kids in the engineering college to having, it's now, I think it's still the fastest growing, and it's one of the largest student organizations on campus with hundreds and hundreds of members. So we saw that student interest really spiking. I was teaching an 800 student communication class, and just so this is, anecdotal, but I asked my students in January, how many of you have heard of ChatGPT? And maybe 10% had, raised their hand. And I said, how many of you have used it? And about 3% confessed to having used it for course related work. I asked the exact same question before I gave my lecture on ChatGPT the second to last week of the semester. I asked the exact same question, and we were up to about 80% had heard of it. So name recognition went through the roof during that semester. And we were at over 50% had used it or had admitted to using it for course related work. And I didn't ask him if it was nefarious or otherwise, but so we went, it was orders of magnitude increase, both in name recognition and in student use over the course of that one semester. And that was another driver behind all of this. Yeah. Currently, I just asked our academic dishonesty team where things stand. ADR, academic dishonesty report filings are significantly down related to ChatGPT this year versus where they were in May of 23. Yeah, like there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them in May of 23. And thus far in April of 24, we're at like 100 for this semester. I don't know why, nor does he, but that's where we are. And this is not, this is maybe just like proxy evidence. It's not indicative of anything, but there are 19,000 GPT 3.5 accounts that have an msu.edu email address, and about 600 or 700 GPT-4 accounts that have an msu.edu address currently. So that's where we are.
Oh, that's super helpful. So that's the kind of cool thing that I learn when I get to talk with Jeremy. Yeah, I'll echo that. And this is something I'm curious about from all of you. We did have the initial sort of worry and panic, and certainly all the news outlets that reached out to me and a handful of others who were identified by the university as having some expertise in this area made that the big headline, especially coming into 2023, was, will students use this to cheat? And that's all that the newspapers and radio people wanted to talk about. We didn't actually see that as a form of panic come to pass, I don't think.
Yeah, which has been a relief. But it's also, anecdotally, again, in all of my kind of roadshow stuff around campus, I'm seeing a lot of faculty members not just faculty members, but educators writ large, who are saying, just don't use this tool. And, so that's that kind of the head in the sand mentality. And if that's the case, and then they don't want to play traffic cop and police this stuff either, then maybe we're just not. Yeah. We're losing a lot of.
Yeah. We're going to come back to that and put a fine point on that for all of you too, because we'd like to hear your point of view on that. But
Yeah, so just to get through the history here, ultimately the meeting of the minds people worked all summer, and we came up with a plan on the academic guidance side. Nothing that came out of it we're calling policy, but we did get it to come from the provost's inbox, which was helpful. And we were very intentional about the way that we ordered the release of these things. So the first thing that came out was the procurement guidance and the data policy guidance. That came out in midsummer. The next thing that came out was guidance for the educators on campus and support toolkits that came out of the Center for Teaching and Learning. That guidance said, it basically said, we as an institution are going to acknowledge that this tool exists. We're not going to ban it. And we're going to support those of you who want to use it in its appropriate use. Then we came out, once the students got on campus at the end of August, we said, we as an institution acknowledge that this tool exists. So do all of your professors. If you want to use this tool, ask before you AI. That was kind of our student facing mantra, right? And we wanted to make sure that we had the educator community as up to speed as possible on this before we released the hounds and had all the students asking them, can I use this in my class? And we didn't make it just about class. We made it about anything where a student had some possible use of this. So student work on campus, administrative work on campus. We have a lot of undergrad research going on. So students in that capacity, undergrad learning assistants, students in that capacity. And we said, if you're in any of these spaces or a class, whoever is the quote unquote adult in charge, ask them before you use these tools. And that was kind of our broad stroke early fall entree into this conversation about the ethics around the use of these tools. And then finally, the committees kept working. We came out with some meaningful research guidance, which maybe you can talk about, Bill. And that came out in December.
Yeah, I'll just mention how that happened and then a little bit about the substance that might be interesting. So what we were seeing, as I mentioned from the spring, was there was a considerable amount of urgency of people doing research with AI in a particular subject area and also research on generative AI. And it became obvious that we needed some conversations about that. Could we spend MSU dollars on it? And if so, under what terms and conditions? What kind of information could we share when we're using these commercial models? That kind of thing. Here again, we couldn't get to policy because it's such a variable scenario. And we were also dealing with, at the same time, the federal agencies. You might remember I think in October, the White House had a letter that came out and indicated what the federal stance or the federal guidance would be that would then flow down through different agencies. And before that, it was there was mostly speculation. No one really knew if you were supposed to use it or you're supposed to not use it. And we were finally starting to see some rulemaking towards the end of the fall, and we felt like it was time that we could broadcast a research statement. So for research purposes, here's what we're aiming at. And it flies a little higher level than maybe some of the teaching and learning. I think closer to a values statement. It would say something like, where we want trust and integrity in a peer review process, we don't use AI in that process, that kind of thing.
Another thing that happened over the course of fall semester and which is now in place is the provost's office it has an ethics institute. Is it the Ethics Institute or initiative? So the Provost Ethics Institute took pretty much a full focus on generative AI. And so there's additional working groups happening now under the auspices of the Provost's office. Bill and I are working on both of those, both with eyes on research and teaching and learning. To create, again, what we're always calling guidance, not policy, because we know that there's going to need to be a level of flexibility in all of this stuff. And we're advocating for obvious dating of the statements so that we know when these things are applicable. And but there's really good work that's coming out of that.
Yeah, I agree. One
Oh,
of
there was the
yeah,
first
there,
bullet.
yeah,
Look at, I know,
yeah, there it
I know
is.
this coming.
One of the, so these are all of the trends that we've highlighted, I think are relevant here, and they describe more or less the present state. Just over the horizon, it might be interesting to hear about what we're doing with a couple of these last two areas in particular. I think of those as our kind of horizon mapping and maybe even aspirational state. We're trying to think about use cases, for example. We're seeing these models more or less today as standalone as they're ever going to be, where you have to log into a separate service to use ChatGPT, for example. But increasingly, starting last summer, they're becoming embedded in the other tools that we already adopt on campus. And so it's not meaningful anyway to say you can't use them, because there they are. They're in Word, they're in Google Docs, they're in everything. So what does that mean? Just avert your eyes. You can't look at it. Or are we going to take more significant steps? We had a conversation among the IT staff about what would happen when our version of Microsoft 365 rolled out the pilot model to us. So there are those use cases, I think, consume a lot of our effort now in terms of where will it be, what will its sort of range of influence be, who will be able to see it, and under what terms and conditions might we need to have more guidance.
Yeah, and on that front, in the teaching and learning space specifically, as many of you in the room know, so much of the ed tech space is now software as a service. And just kind of the rollout process that exists with those things. The updates just kind of come when they come. So I just was talking to ed tech leadership on campus, and they've put a freeze on turning on new learning tools within the LMS until we get a clear roadmap from those tools about what they're going to do with generative AI and with large language models and with the data that comes from them. That's not to say we're banning the use of tools that have generative AI built in, but we want to make sure before we flip the switch on that we know if the plan is for them to turn on something that's going to suck FERPA protected data into the cloud without our knowledge and feed the algorithm without our knowledge. And that's a lesson learned from the Turnitin experience, where they just automatically default on had some really problematic things, or perceived as problematic on our campus anyways. Same thing was true with Copilot, where we wanted to be sure that we had some barrier in place to a flip happening where all of a sudden we were losing HIPAA protected data into the algorithm, or we were losing intellectual property in ways that we were not really okay with. So,
yeah, so I think the best way to describe what we're trying to work towards being intentional about, and this is pretty widely shared in the official language that we've seen from the provost's office, but also among the working groups, is a culture of transparency and ethical use as the main goal. That's where we want to build. And as a result of that, we are in wait and see mode in a few of these cases, and we're also in cautiously proceeding mode in others. What I don't think we're in is in reckless, let's give it a whirl mode. And that's part of, I would say, MSU's institutional culture too.
Yeah, I think so. And in part because the Ethics Institute is kind of at the forefront of this institutionally, but also just because of the reality of the situation. For example, coming out of the teaching center that I run, we're not going to do workshops about how to use a specific generative AI tool in a classroom. Because that's a moving target that we're never going to stay caught up with. The workshops we're going to run are going to be about ethics and how do you teach the ethical use of these tools within the discipline? How do you B, as an educator, use these tools ethically to help with the administrative processes of teaching? To what degree are you being transparent about, I used AI to create this rubric, or to help me create the outline for this slide deck, or I used Sora to create this instructional video for you, God forbid.
Yeah, I think maybe that's the one thing that is exciting to me about that last bullet is we might always think about it coming from students that we want them to be transparent, but we really are seeing this as a reciprocal relationship.
Yeah. And the one other bullet point that we're going to emphasize on the ethics front is also just a pedagogical ethics question, which is, what is your role as an educator in preparing this population of graduates, future graduates, for the workforce? And this is getting the heads out of the sand a little bit. What are your advisory boards telling you is going on with the use of these tools in the fields that your graduates are going to feed into? What does that mean for your course? Why does your course even exist? And to what extent do you need to modify your teaching, your practices, or your curriculum to make sure that your students who are graduating out of your programs are ready for the workforce? And that's a harder conversation to have, but it's one that I think we have to have. And it's obviously that's a long play. Right. In the immediate, it's yes, these tools exist. They're going to be used, so use them transparently and ethically. That's the heads out of the sand, heads out of the clouds bullet point. I think keeping the focus on ethics is, it feels to me like I have my feet on solid ground when I have those conversations. When I go into the packaging school and start talking about a specific lesson plan where a specific student used ChatGPT to solve a physics problem, what do I do next semester with that same physics problem? Those are much harder conversations to have. They're very important conversations to have, but they're so situational and so specific to the individual class. I think when we're talking about institutional response, we need to not be worried about the tool sets and the lesson plans, and we need to be worried about the mindsets and the action plans. We are seeing, I believe that right now where we are, and you mentioned this earlier, Bill, that the immediate reaction from U of M was to build their own model, but we now know that is not as powerful as the things that are coming out of the private sector, just in terms of compute power. It's cool that they have it and that they can do generative AI type work with some level of security. But part of the problem is industry is clearly leading this. Private sector is clearly leading this charge. And we need to figure out how to work with the private sector on this one. In the same way that we have in the ed tech space for a long, long time. But I don't think that in-house solutions are going to be viable for this just because of the raw compute power that's required and the cost of spinning that stuff up. So that means that we need to figure out how to navigate this weird capitalist landscape that we're in right now, where they are all trying to figure out how to profitize this, and they all are looking at higher ed as one real potential profit driver. So they're creating all these bright, shiny objects and going and knocking on individual faculty members' doors to get them to use their new toy, so that it gets ingrained into the curriculum or the program, and then we owe them, $100,000 a year. And we've seen that model play out over and over and over again. We need to figure out how to prepare the landscape to prevent from happening with generative AI what happened with publisher content. That's one of the fights that I'm willing to pick. It's going to be a tough one though. And we need to talk to our advisory boards and industry and have a clear sense of what's going on out in the world, and how these tools are being deployed. Specifically, don't let them stop at saying you need to teach your students about AI. Say, well, why? What is happening in your specific field? How is it being used? To what extent is it changing the job market? What jobs are being changed, modified, coalescing together because of the use of these tools? what new jobs are being created, and how can we as educational partners in the pipeline of this discipline make sure that the next generation of people who enter into the field are prepared to do so, with some level of fortitude. You want to talk on the research side?
Yeah. So one of the ways that I come at this that I think is helpful, and the reason why I've maybe played a somewhat helpful role at my institution thus far, but which I also see that changing, and I'll talk about that in a second, is because the majority of the substance of impact of Gen AI so far has been on, for lack of a better word, academic writing. And it's all the kinds of academic writing that we ask students to do, but also that faculty do. And so the trend that I see happening this year, and especially now compared to, let's say, a year ago, and if I just look at my own calendar, in the upcoming month, I have facilitating two workshops, one in biochemistry and one in the College of Nursing. And they're both around the same essential topic, which I think is grounded in an ethical question, but making that ethical stance a kind of foundation for decision making in a very pragmatic way. And that is, how can AI be useful in my writing workflow of what I have to do? And where are the boundaries of that? Can I use it to do a lit review for a journal article? And if so, what kinds of risks do I introduce into my process if it's going to hallucinate sources? Are there credible and reasonable mitigations for those risks that make it a useful tool or not? There are other boundaries that we think about. So, for example, with the biochemistry folks, we talked a lot about, would you ever feed your raw data in? Let's assume that you don't have a copyright problem, you have an enterprise model, and ask it to create inferences from that data. And when you ask them that question, you'll get a slightly different answer about how they might see that working or not. But what you can get to is some analogies and some current practices that might help them understand, for example, how they already rely on what might be black box technologies for many of them to create results. So I gave an example a while back when we were on the panel of a gas chromatograph, right? So the sociologist of science, Bruno Latour, calls devices like that transcription devices. What does he mean by that? He means you put some things in there and out comes a written representation of those things that you can then use to make an article. Now, in gas chromatographs of a few years ago, you might have had to do some things to get a display, but now it'll just print you a display right out of the thing. It's not too much more of a leap to connect that same machine to an LLM, and it'll just write it for you. By the way, that's your near future. It's already happening at the Consumer Electronics Show this year. The big trend was showing how LLMs can be embedded in internet connected devices like your car. So Volkswagen showed how ChatGPT can send you an email from your car. Isn't that what we all want? Email from our car. But my point is, these conversations get really concrete really fast in disciplinary contexts. And I think that's what I see happening now is all these disciplines are trying to set what the terms and conditions are going to be for what's this new world where some other thing is going to help us write. I'll draw one more boundary because I think it also foreshadows a conversation that we'll need to have, and that is this era of if they've been standalone and now they're becoming more embedded, if they've been mostly software and now they're going to also be in hardware devices. They've been mostly words, except for the image generators, which are largely disruptive only in a very narrow sense. But we're entering a phase now where we have anything to anything multimodal models. Anything in, anything out, audio, video, image, text. That's going to change. It's going to render up much of my perspective on the academic writing side rather niche concern, like it always has been in my career. I'll go back to not being people not caring much about what we do. That'd be fine. That'd be fine with me. But we're going to get more and more focus on the societal effects of being able to clone someone's voice and present a credible facsimile of them to do things like scam people, which we're already seeing happening.
Yeah, and so this again speaks to transparency. And I think as we consider specifically through the lens of online education, it's that stuff that is the wicked problem that we really need to steel ourselves for. I've been reading and talking about self-impersonation and using these tools to do just that, to impersonate yourself. It takes 15 seconds of audio to clone a voice with the latest GPT tools. What's that mean if one of your instructional practices is a weekly podcast and you have been for the last 10 years pushing out a weekly podcast in your online class to give students updates about the class and give them feedback on their stuff? Now I can train a model to recreate my voice to near perfection with just 15 seconds of that podcast, and I can push out any announcement that I want without actually doing the work. So as an educator, I can impersonate myself and create instructional content, audio, video, written, that I didn't really have a say in the authorship of, but I can push it out to students as if I did. And the students obviously can see the same pathways for the work that they're going to submit. And in the online learning space specifically, controlling for that is going to be something that we really need to get our heads around quickly. And it's why I don't think it'll be sufficient, but it's at least a start. Getting the ethical groundwork laid so that our students are coming in and putting that ethical stuff into like the new student orientation modules and everything, so that students are coming in with an expectation of ethical behavior and a clear understanding of the institution's positionality on this stuff, I think is going to be really important going forward.
Yeah, we've put a few other trends here we've alluded to that we're happy to talk further about in the Q&A, but we mentioned that we're seeing two kinds of approaches to making a model available on campus in an enterprise context, which is important for keeping all of your regulatory responsibilities in line, whether that's HIPAA or FERPA or all of those things. They are build your own, and you're usually doing that at the expense of more compute cycles and more parameters in the model available in the commercial model. Probably get outpaced in a quicker amount of time versus contracting with one of the big general model providers, base model providers. And we've seen Arizona State, no surprise there, is kind of out in front, forming a partnership with OpenAI that will probably become a benchmark for many other big public research institutions. So there are already two kind of approaches to this that are emerging. A third that we may be seeing, we've heard conversations, Jeremy and I have each been in meetings with our counterparts in the Big Ten Academic Alliance, which is a thing. A lot of people might not realize, but all the Big Ten schools and a handful of others in the Chicagoland area are part of an academic group that is really heavily networked, not just at the top, but in the functional roles across the institution. So we all meet in our affiliate groups in the BTAA routinely. So I meet with other associate deans of research in colleges of arts and sciences across that group. And the talk there is, should we as a consortium do some things together, which might help us overcome some of the limitations in compute power and things like that. And of course, we've done that before with other technological advances like Internet 2 and so forth.
Yeah, Internet 2 is a great example. And the hope would be that we can follow the same model with this. And the BTAA is able to wield a pretty significant amount of clout when it comes to these conversations, if we can get our ducks in a row. And that's not always possible. And now we're bringing in all these West Coast people. So who knows, right?
That's right.
But it is a poorly told but really significant story for schools like ours, that the Big Ten is, I believe, unique in this position where the academic collegiality is really almost more definitional to the conference than the athletic competition. We all work together a whole lot. And like all of my best professional friends are from other Big Ten institutions who wear similar hats to mine, because we meet all the time and talk about this stuff all the time. And we have like shared Google Docs and spreadsheets where we're saying, who's using this tool? What's your common syllabus language? What's your response to this? So if I need to know what's happening across the conference, I can get that information very easily.
Yeah,
And
in about a day.
yeah.
Usually.
Yeah, and from an IT procurement perspective, that's clearly pretty powerful, where if we can all be asking the exact same questions at the exact same time of OpenAI or Microsoft, that's going to land pretty high up in their C-suite as they're making decisions about what these enterprise licenses would look like. And that means that we can control the narrative to a certain degree. We can drive home issues like accessibility, data security, FERPA and HIPAA compliance, intellectual property rights. Like these are things that matter a lot to higher ed that might not be top of mind to the Silicon Valley types.
Yeah, I agree. The last item we have on this slide is what we see as, and from a research standpoint, what I see as the immediate barrier to an even broader movement towards adoption in both of those camps I mentioned, research on and research with AI, particularly research with AI. Right now, if you ask the average researcher who isn't using it but sees a potential application why, they would say, I can't trust that it's accurate. And so if we can get past that hurdle through a series of quasi-regulatory rulemaking level enforcement of some quality measures and some transparency guidelines, I think we will be in a whole new era where there will be, just like there's almost no research now that isn't somehow digital, so everyone uses a computer to do something as part of their research, there will likely be very few areas untouched by AI in the near future.
So these are the things that we can't sleep because of. And again, you'll see similar themes to the stuff that we've mentioned.
Yeah, so the first one is our head in the sand question, and we're eager to hear what your responses to this are on your campuses. Have we reached the point where we're beginning to ask, is it okay to not pay attention? Is the Bartleby position defensible still for a little while longer? I prefer not to. We're just coming with all the literary references today. And at what point do we cross over and say, this is a non-optional issue that everyone has to at least address? We haven't been there yet. We've been a coalition of the mostly willing and the reluctant, I would say, grudgingly reluctant. But it seems plausible that this is on the horizon.
Yeah, it was interesting working in the business school. There was much more rapidity towards that position coming from industry. So that because I joined the Center for Teaching and Learning in October, so I was at the last advisory board meetings in the business school in spring, and they were pretty much at that point where it's like, this is not optional. If we're looking to hire broad school graduates, they need to be more than conversant in matters generative AI, and that was pretty evident. So it's now integrated into their strategic plan over there in the B school, which isn't surprising that they're moving fast because they're so responsive to those types of external pressures. But it's coming down for every other college on our campus, I'm sure. And then the second question is, what are we doing locally in the vacuum that we're all living in currently? We don't have enough regulation. We don't have enough high-level guidance, and we've got billionaire capitalists running full steam ahead with these really, really, really powerful tools. What are we doing in that space?
And I think we're going to leave those questions linger out there. So maybe you'll give us the answers, or we'll invite you to respond. Thank you.
Yeah, we'd love to hear some questions from you. Yeah, wait to talk till they have the microphone. There's one coming. Behind you. Behind you.
I'm curious, you mentioned, thank you for all that. You mentioned that you were aware of how many people had OpenAI accounts that were on your system. How were you able to find that?
I don't know how they got that number.
Oh, okay,
someone gave it to me though,
Okay.
but it's also not, it doesn't really reveal that much because those are just the people who use the msu.edu account. So, I think it's just indicative of we've got about what, 80,000 people tied to our campus
Roughly.
between students, faculty, and staff. So we got 20,000 that have accounts using those email addresses. Of course, our alumni could play into that population too, I suppose. Sorry, I don't know how that number came to be, but other questions or thoughts, or maybe even better answers to our two last questions.
Yeah.
That's really what we need.
Those good ones. Are you at that point in where you feel like either because your student constituency or your faculty status, whatever, it's not a thing that people can afford to not address? Or are you still giving people a little bit of time to go, I can't deal with it right now?
I was trying to patiently wait. I think we are there at South University. We've been trying to, like other folks, take a little bit of a cautious approach so that we don't kind of put the cart before the horse. I was saying yesterday to somebody, it's challenging because they do want policy. It's interesting. The faculty are like, we want a policy. It's like, I don't know if it's going to be a policy. And it's hard to create a policy for something that we are still learning about, that is still emerging, right? Our policy will be very outdated very quickly. But I am seeing from the faculty, they want this policy, right? Which to me is, yes, we need to take a position, have a philosophy, a value statement, whatever we're going to call it, to give that structure to faculty, because I see faculty waiting for it. The other thing I think that relates to that, in listening to Macomb and their various levels, I know Nathan shared AI modalities in the micro seminar we had earlier this year. My concern is, out of fear or not knowing, they'll just go to restrictive, which I think, Jeremy, you had said you're finding you gave them kind of a lot of lanes to go in, and because they haven't yet explored it or don't understand it, that's fine. We'll just opt out. And I don't want to see that happen either. So I do think we're there. And those are kind of the things that are telling me that we're there.
Our syllabus guidance follows the exact 4 same tiers of deployment within a class. And for the restrictive environment, I've encouraged my team to say, if you feel the need to restrict its use or to ban its use in your class, cool, that's your decision. But you need to do so with a level of clarity and specificity that you might not be used to. You have to tell your students why it is that you're not allowing its use, and you have to give specific examples about the type of work that you're going to do, or the type of knowledge that you're going to try to impart over the course of the class that needs to not be influenced by generative AI. And you need to do that very early, if not before the semester, to try to level up that intrinsic motivation for students to not cheat, because we can't keep them from using the tools. We just can't. And the only ones that we're catching are the ones who are bad at using the tools.
Yeah, we can get a single shot really fast back against the wall desperation. Yeah. Those are easy for everyone to see, but you don't need an algorithm to tell you that.
Right. The kid who gave it absolutely zero thought and printed the thing out 4 minutes before the class started, yeah, you're going to catch that one. But everyone else who's using it with some level of intelligence, they are still going to use it unless we can build up some internal buffer within every student about, for me to grow, for me to get the actual learning gains out of this class that I'm paying for, I need to not use that tool. I need to do it this way. So it really becomes, it's about this kind of classroom demeanor and about these pedagogical practices, early semester specifically, where you're trying to build a culture of transparency and ethics surrounding these tools, even if you're banning it. In fact, the ethical conversation is maybe most important in a class where you're restricting its use, because you're not banning its use. You're just telling people not to use it.
We have
Yeah.
about 5 more minutes, so we have some room.
So in response to your second question about local action.
Yeah.
So it seems like you're presenting this dichotomy of, we either go with the corporate AI tools and have robust data access, or we go with an in-house closed model and have greater data security. So that's a potential, right, path,
Yeah,
split in the road.
I would say it feels like that's where those are our choices today.
So what, can you share what led to MSU taking one approach versus another approach, right, at least at the moment?
Yeah, I think we've opted out of both, right? We're dragging our feet. Maybe we're in the middle.
Well, I think the in-house solution takes a lot of capital up front, and the schools that have done it have a lot of capital, universally. And we, I think on the other side, the corporate relationship question, yeah, we've kind of not done it, but by default, we've chosen not to decide. So it's just like a free for all, right? And we've got accounts all over the place, and we've got individual departments making their own decisions, and, it's not ideal. To me, the ideal end state would be some kind of enterprise agreement that creates essentially a one-way pipeline where we get all the benefit of the algorithm and we pay a premium for it, but we don't feed anything back into it. And I hope that that's the direction that we can go with these contractual discussions. And that's why we need big consortia to do it, because otherwise we're just going to get, it's going to be exorbitantly expensive.
Yeah, the other worry there is that we then have a big dependency over what could rapidly become an essential tool. And you're handing that power to an entity that is not a public institution. We already kind of do that with some of our software vending situations when you have a big enterprise system like Microsoft, but at least there's a more than one choice, and it doesn't feel as totalizing across the full mission. So I think there's caution on that score too.
Yeah, definitely.
Have you talked with the consortium about, thank you. Have you talked with the consortium, the Big Ten consortium, about developing something for that group of schools? Maybe that could be like an alternative solution to either of those two other options.
I think the IT groups within that consortium and some other that are heavily populated by Big Ten schools like Unison Consortium, they're in early conversations right now. A lot of it, again, academic calendar year constraints, is likely to pick up over the summer when some of these things happen and when a lot of these like in-person meetings and these consortia take place. Do you have a question here? I'll repeat it for the group. So the question is, there's some kind of hybridized solution to this, where we might combine some of the affordances of an in-house build, some of the affordances of vendor A, vendor B, vendor C, pool it all into one thing. I think that'd be really cool, but that adds a layer of complexity to the conversation that we are already finding to be quite a slog to get through. So I think that sounds like Internet 2 to me, which took a long time to get to after the advent of the Internet.
15 years, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
I think we're about out of time, so we're going to say thank you, give you a minute to stretch and adjust before. Would you like to preview the next session?
All right.
Okay.
Thank you,
you
everyone,
very
very much. Really appreciate it.